Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm one of those victims, and will survive the next 90 minutes. I have the privilege and the pleasure to introduce this afternoon Zhan, Professor and Director of Northeast Normal University, who's our first speaker today. And let us begin, if I may, with your presentation. As you can see, we are learning. Thank you. Please.
Thanks, National Graduate Institute for Policy Study. Thanks, Oscar. My English, I'm sorry, my English is not good, so I try to speak and I try to answer your question. So, my name is Zhan from China. Today my presentation is partial participation China and the international nuclear non-proliferation regime from 1978 to 1992. Many scholars divided China participation in the international nuclear non-proliferation regime into three stages: a fundamental rejection of regime before the end of the 1970s, partial participation in the 1980s, and full participation after the end of the Cold War around the 1990s. So the first stage is fundamental rejection. From 1949 to the end of 1970s, China faced crisis caused by the threat of a nuclear attack by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States threatened to use nuclear weapons against China during the Korean War and the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1954 and 1958. When China successfully carried out nuclear tests in October 16, 1964, the United States regarded China nuclear development as a most serious problem, so tried to bomb China nuclear facility. So China opposed the international nuclear non-proliferation regime dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. So China criticized both partial test ban treaty and in 1963 and NPT in 1968. The second stage is partial participation. Although China began to reform and open up in the late 1970s, China joined the IAEA and negotiated nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States. But China's attitude toward NPT didn't change fundamentally. And the third stage is full participation after 1992. China firmly stopped its critical and revolutionary attitude toward NPT after the end of the Cold War. On March 9, 1992, China firmly acceded NPT and began to fully participate in the international nuclear non-proliferation regime. So today I will tell a story about China and NPT during the 1980s, the second stage, and I try to tell three cases. I will try to explore the political reason behind China's refusal to exit NPT and subsequent change in attitude toward the international nuclear non-proliferation regime. So the first case is China joined IAEA. After the time of the IAEA founding, the People's Republic of China was not a member state Instead, Taiwan was founding member state. In 1971, the United Nations restored People's Republic of China legitimacy, providing China with an opportunity to join the IAEA. Although IAEA had officially disengaged with Taiwan, ties between the two still remained. Taiwan had already signed two safeguard agreements with IAEA. Moreover, the Chinese government remained critical of the international nuclear non-proliferation regime controlled by the United States and the Soviet Union during the Maoist era. So China therefore condemned NPT and displayed no intentions of joining IAEA. Deng Xiaoping had launched a reform and open-up policy in 1978. The China nuclear program was shifted from serving military purposes to include both military and civilian projects. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs pointed out that IAEA had already expelled Taiwan in December 1971 and recognized the government of the People's Republic of China was only one with the right to respect China in agency. So suggests the second Ministry of Machine Building that China joined the IAEA. However, China still had a reservation regarding IAEA membership. First, possible negative consequence of China nuclear policy joined the IAEA. The second is about the safeguard. The third is Taiwan. So IAEA provided explanation. The first IAEA, unlike another international organization, mostly free from politics. Therefore, China nuclear policy would not be restrained unreasonable. Second, China already been a nuclear state and would not run into safeguard problem in theory. Finally, Taiwan had already been expelled from IAEA in December 1972, so China would not join the agency as a new member state. Rather, it would be replacing Taiwan in it. So in March 1982, the newly appointed IAEA Director General Hans Blix told China that he was interested in visiting China. So as a result, China welcomed and China began accelerating this process toward IAEA membership. So in 1983, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Nuclear Industry, and the State Science of Technology Commission drafted jointly a report and submitted it to the State Council for a formal application to join the IAEA. On January 1st, 1984, China became official member state. This is the first case, and the second case is nuclear cooperation negotiation between China and the United States. In the 1978, the Chinese government began economic reform and looking to procure foreign nuclear technology to construct nuclear power station in China. On October 17, 1982, China and the United States signed a protocol on cooperation in nuclear safety matters in Washington. This marked the beginning of the China and the United States peaceful nuclear cooperation. However, rumors alleging that China had been secretly helping Pakistan with a developing nuclear project. So on January 18, 1983, President Reagan decided to cooperate with China in nuclear technology. However, he listed three conditions. The first condition is a convincing assurance from Paris level that China will not assist any country to obtain nuclear weapons. Second, Chinese commitment adhere to international norms and it is nuclear export practice. The third, Chinese agreement to adequate bilateral procedures to assure that the United States export would not be used for any military. So China was displeased with the United States for its attempt to use nuclear trade to frame China into the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, and citing once again and again it is reservation and criticism of the NPT. On January 1st, 1984, China officially became the IAEA member state, which propelled further improvement of China and the United States relations. So Chinese Prime Minister Zhao Ziyang visited the United States on January 10, 1984. During this visit, he said China will not outwit nuclear proliferation, not engage in nuclear proliferation, and not help other countries. So from April 26 to May 1, 1984, President Reagan visited China to sign a pact on the peaceful use of nuclear energy. China was a full affair of the difficult in the China and the United States Peaceful Nuclear Cooperation Agreement on issue of the nuclear non-proliferation. Prime Minister Li Peng said Beijing has never intended to, is not going to, and will not in future help other countries to develop nuclear weapons in order to keep its promise to and fulfill its obligation to the IAEA. After a yearly delay, China and the United States officials signed United States Peaceful Nuclear Cooperation Agreement in 1985, which paved the way for United States power company to join China nuclear power plant. However, the United States Congress still remained suspicious of the agreement. The third case is China announced cessation of atmospheric nuclear testing. China was known to critical of the 1963 PTPP and the international nuclear non-proliferation regime dominated by the United States and Soviet Union. China's position on the PTPP didn't change for 2 decades. However, nuclear pollution gradually became forced on the international community. Many countries perceive China to cessation atmosphere testing. For example, Deng Xiaoping visited United States in early 1979. President Carter used this opportunity to urge China to give up on testing, but Deng refused. However, since China formally joined the IAEA and signed the Sino-United States Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, its nuclear non-proliferation policy were changed. On October 24, 1985, Prime Minister Zhao Ziyang attended a special session of the United Nations. On his way to the United Nations, Zhao received a piece of information about impending nuclear tests in China. So he immediately ordered Foreign Minister Wu Xueqian to open letter to Deng Xiaoping to stop schedule nuclear tests. So the central government and Deng Xiaoping acceded to his request and stopped all preparation for nuclear testing. China's cessation of atmospheric nuclear testing in 1981 and the state declared in 1968 marked China's fulfillment of obligation to obey nuclear test restriction of PTPP. So the conclusion. China's participation in the international nuclear non-proliferation regime has been a gradual process. In Mao Zedong area, China nuclear strategy was strongly influenced by idealism. On the one hand, China stood on the side of oppressed nations, strongly opposing the nuclear monopoly held by superpower. On the other hand, China was not simply focused on nuclear disarmament policy, but a total ban and complete elimination of nuclear weapons. With the deepening of the reform and opening China Revolution, diplomacy based on ideas of class struggle gradually give way to placing national interest at the core of diplomacy. Joint IAEA and cooperation agreement with the United States and announcing cessation of nuclear tests were three major steps in China January towards to international nuclear non-proliferation. Joint IAEA signal a change in China attitude towards the profession international organization. Believe it would be lead to exchange development of advanced technology. Joint IAEA was an opportunity that China used to accept cooperation with other countries in nuclear energy. Negotiation with the United States appears the most twist and turn, and mainly reflect difference between the two countries regarding nuclear non-proliferation regime. In fact, China has ceased nuclear tests since October 16, 1980, and used it on party action, full obligation to nuclear testing restriction despite non-accede to PTBT. China believes that NPT allowed the United States and Soviet Union to forever possess nuclear domination, and denying other countries the right to possess a legitimate means self-defense and ideal competition to Mao Zedong revolution diplomacy. When China began the policy reform and opening in the late 1970s, the two superpowers were still competing for global domination. China's attitude toward NPT didn't change fundamentally because it believed that only the United States and the Soviet Union first stop vertical proliferation, where the other countries could only stop horizontal proliferation. So China firmly quick it is critical and revolutionary attitude toward NPT after the end of the Cold War to break the West section against China in 1989. On March 1992, China firmly acceded to the NPT and began fully participate in the international nuclear non-proliferation regime. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have the privilege again to introduce someone I believe we all know and have given us such a wonderful opportunity. It is Professor Yoko Iwama of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies.
Okay, I'm not going to speak much because most of what I wanted to do actually Nidhi already beautifully covered. I just wanted to give you a chance to think about Japan because you traveled all the way here and going back without having a chance to ask questions on Japan, I thought that would be too much pity. Let me just stand up. I won't speak much because Nidhi covered most of this. I'm just going to come up with my research question, why I got there. So this is Japan after the war. It was occupied by US and they got a new constitution very early, which was very pacific. And then 52 it goes into, this is the sovereignty recovery, and then 56, USSR was against Japan joining the UN because we didn't have a peace treaty with the USSR, we still don't. But after the joint declaration, they conditionally supported Japan becoming a member, and that's why we kind of re-entered. Now, the Geneva committees that all of us have been talking a lot about, Japan wanted to be it always wanted to be a member, but in 1960 it starts as 10 nations committee and then becomes 18 nations, and then 69 is the moment when Japan joins. And these are the members, the original members here, and then it was added, I think somebody talked about this today, these countries were added. These 2 days I've learned a lot about each of the countries, but I'm still not clear why these countries were chosen. So I hope to find more about it. And Japan is only a member here, but it has been trying since early 60s to get in somehow. And then I was corresponding with John Hunt, and one of his papers inspired me to think about, what was Japan's strategy? Was it aware of the non-aligned world and the potential of these countries? Did it use that reason to sort of pry open the membership? I hoped to find some material to be able to say, yes, I haven't. So Japan is in a very peculiar position psychologically. It is, well, at this stage, if you think about it, is the only Asian and non-sort of European white people who is in a developed position. But there's always this potential racial complex that Japan has, and there's always this longing to be admitted into the Society of Asian Countries. So it has this very ambiguous attitude towards the Bandung Conference and so on, and there's a series of research ongoing about Japan's very subtle diplomacy between US on the other hand and the Asian countries down there, and trying to sort of find a way of not angering the US but still doing something for the Southeast Asians. But in this case I haven't found anything yet, so I will keep looking. But so far as I've found, these are the countries that in 1960 it was apparently the Soviet side that proposed to include these countries. Oops, never mind. And then Americans tried to bring in Japan and Pakistan as a sort of a neutral country, because Japan was not a NATO country, but the Soviet Union said, no, Japan's a NATO American ally, so you can't count it as a neutral country. So in the end, they came down to these members for the 18 nation countries. You look into the archives and you see foreign ministers talking to the Soviet Union, we want to be member of the committee. And this is 1964 Tokyo Olympics. I just wanted to show you, there was an excitement in Tokyo. And it was right in the middle of this centennial event that the Chinese people dared to bring this on. But I really don't think Japan was worried that much. But you heard Nidhi talk about this. I'll skip all this. This was the place of the explosion, and then very quickly they mastered other sorts of technology. And you heard about Prime Minister Sato, although he personally held inclination to develop some sort of nuclear weapon. He didn't. And in the end, he was the person who established the 3 non-nuclear principles and so on. I forgot to correct this. He was the longest-serving Prime Minister until this summer, right? And now Prime Minister Abe is the longest-serving Prime Minister. But I think we remember him very much because of Okinawa Reversion and the Nobel Peace Prize after that. So this, 60s to 70s is a continuous rising for Japan and becoming a member of the. And it was also, I think, when Japan acquired its sort of tactics to put forward, we are the only country that experienced the nuclear bomb, and therefore we have the right to be member of these communities to think about nuclear weapons. Nidhi talked about all this. I just want to add that Japan, although openly committing not to make nuclear weapons, has been very adamant to be at the top level of nuclear technology as well as rocket technology, still is. And we talked about this in the last conference, but currently all these programs are so divided in different bureaucracies, so I don't really think that we can decide day X that we're going to go nuclear, and Prime Minister Abe orders you make the weapons, you make the delivery system, and we will go nuclear. It will not go like that. So 65s are going on, and interestingly, so it's not until Japan deliberates joining the NPT that the real prospect of ENDC membership becomes real. There's also a rearrangement of foreign ministry bureaucracy on the occasion. And then the first decision was to add Japan and Mongolia. That was the spring of 69, I think. And then as 69 went on, there were several other countries added. But by summer, Japan knew very definitely that it was going to be a member, and that is why they signed in the end in February 1970. If they had waited longer, it would have meant that the number of the countries that had entered would reach certain stage, and they would have to ratify much sooner. Now, they waited a long time to ratify. Partly it was because of the European countries, Eurozone, negotiating the verification treaty, and when they got that deal, we said we want the same deal. Okay? Right, I did use my time. So, and then 76 was the ratification under Prime Minister Miki. So I think I've covered virtually everything. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have again the pleasure of introducing Takeda, who is the lecturer of Hiroshima City University this afternoon. May I ask you to take the floor, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all of you to attend the very last presentation of this two-day conference. And I guess you have a paper handout. Sorry, I'm very old-fashioned, but it's a kind of Japanese traditional style of presentation, so please enjoy. My presentation will focus on a conference called International Nuclear Fuel Cycle Evaluation, and also the North-South Confrontation as a conference from Japanese viewpoint. I choose this topic for several reasons, as I wrote in section 1 of paper handout. And as is already discussed yesterday and today, North-South confrontations on peaceful use of nuclear power was especially severe since early 1970s. And that is because, as you know, the NPT entered into force in 1970, but India successfully detonated its first nuclear devices in 1974. Developed countries in the north tried to tighten export control through NSGs. But as Mr. Milgovich discussed yesterday, that was very irritating for them. So developing countries insisted on inalienable right of peaceful use, as is written in Article 4 of NPT. And at that time, SARS had two groups. One is a non-allied movement on political agendas. So that is the issues such as non-proliferation in nuclear issues. And in fact, NAM Summit in 1979, which is held in Havana, Cuba, criticized export control of developed countries as a serious obstacle to peaceful use of nuclear power. And also Group of 77 was established in 1960s on economic agendas such as peaceful use. So this group also voiced rush for technical assistance for developing countries. But as far as I know, the previous researches on this agenda, North-South relations in nuclear issues, focused on non-nuclear issues or nuclear-related conference in 2000 or 2010s. So that I would like to pick up a conference called INSE from 1977 to 1980. And I choose the viewpoint of Japan because Japan was on the fault line between the North and the South. That means Japan already participated to the meetings of developed countries such as G7 or NSG and other meetings of developed countries. So that one Japanese diplomat described the NAM Summit in 1979 as a student protest rally because it is so radicalized that Cuba tried to has a close relationship with Soviet Union. But also Japan has an identity as a member of Asia since it published first diplomatic blue book in 1957. It was one of three principles of Japanese diplomacy. And also Japan was a strong advocate for peaceful use, even when Japan attended the meeting of NSGs. So that I think Japanese viewpoint will be suitable to look into both North and South in nuclear issues. So let me proceed to the section 2, the main argument of my presentation. INSE was proposed by President Carter in 1977 when he became President of the United States. And he tried to step up US non-proliferation policy toward tighter control of nuclear technologies and materials. The previous administration, such as Ford or Nixon, tightened export control of sensitive technologies and materials, but that is for developing countries. But Carter administration took much simple measures to stop using plutonium all over the world. So Carter administration tried to hold bilateral negotiations to persuade each individual countries, and also to hold INSE to provide some kind of logics to justify its new policy and to find out alternative nuclear fuel cycles that doesn't use plutonium. So, but naturally, Japan, Europe, and also developing countries insisted they need plutonium, or at least they want a possibility to be open in future. So to secure their support to hold a conference, the Carter forced to set back to let first Japan and Europe to set INSE as non-binding technical review conference, so that this conference does not any kind of preconditions or prejudice toward alternative nuclear fuel cycles. That doesn't separate a plutonium. And also, developing countries became chairs of INFCE working groups. Let me explain about this. Could you show my slide? There are some. Oh, thank you. Please look at my slide one. It shows the organization of INFCE. There are 8 working groups and TCC, the Technical Coordination Committee. And 8 working groups deal with several aspects of nuclear fuel cycle, such as fast reactors, is dealt at working group 5, or plutonium reprocessing at working group 4, and assurance of supply of technology or fuel at working group 3, and etc., etc. And TCC, or Technical Coordination Committee, coordinate the workings of each groups. So TCC was a headquarter of INFCE meetings. So by these organizations, INFCE successfully started on October 1977. And although US suffered severe criticisms, still United States took a leadership as TCC chair because Professor Aaron Chase from Harvard University was a TCC chair for 2.5 years until the end of the INFCE. So at least US took a leadership at the headquarters of INFCE. So please proceed to the page 2 of INFCE, of my handout. And so INFCE started, but the South or the developing countries doesn't have much voice on actual working groups. That is because developing countries won an agenda of so-called special needs for developing countries at organized conference in October 1977. So that each these 8 working groups had to think about what kind of assistance or what kind of special needs are available to at each area, such as reprocessing or the supply of nuclear fuel or technology. But in fact, the developing countries doesn't have much resources to devote to working groups. Please look at slide 2. I'm sorry, this is a Japanese document, but it is a table of meetings of INFCE, and the top row is a plenary conference, the conference of the whole, and the second row is a TCC. And there are working groups from working group 1 to working group 8. And each black dot means the meetings are held during 2.5 years. For almost 10 to 30 meetings are held at each working groups. So that was a very heavy burden to pay travel cost or to do a research, gather data, and doing analysis, and write a paper to submit to each meetings of working groups. So that was a very heavy burden for developing countries. So we cannot find that any meaningful contributions from developing countries for each working groups, such as working group 3, which was most important for the South according to the Yugoslavian diplomats. Only Argentina added language on technological development, but that's all. There are no other substantial contribution from the South. And also, working group 4 about plutonium, and the most important working group of INFCE, the India submitted analysis of small-scale reprocessing plant, but it was regarded as inappropriate because of a research method or other or data India used from the viewpoint of Japan, the United States, and other Western European countries. So after INFCE was concluded, one Japanese diplomat described the agenda of special needs as garnish of sashimi. That was in Japanese sashimi no tsuma, which means very thinly sliced vegetables, which is served along with sashimi. So that means it is required to be tabled with sashimi, the main dish, but it doesn't any significant means. So while the South doesn't have any substantial voice on IFSE, the developed countries gradually restore cooperation among United States, Europe, and Japan. At early stages of IFSE working groups, the US suffers severe criticism from almost all participants. So it sounded a new policy to first permit limited use of plutonium to countries having no proliferation risk and advanced nuclear R&D programs, or the actual clear needs for plutonium. So that means Japan and West European countries. And second, if developed countries can agree on policies to use plutonium, they will form common approach on how to deal with demands from South, such as demanding any kind of nuclear technologies to export from developed countries from developing countries. So Japan and subsequently Europe gradually agreed on this new US policy and started talks on concrete terms and conditions when they want to use plutonium. But nonetheless, they couldn't ignore developing countries while having talks within them. That is because on nuclear issues, they had to persuade the South not to acquire sensitive nuclear technologies or materials themselves. And also, more in general, non-allied movement was inclined to have close relationship with Eastern Bloc or Soviet Union under the leadership of Cuba and other so-called radicalized states of non-allied movement. That is a view from Japan or the United States. So developed countries try to have bilateral talks to include their demands, especially the demand from India or Yugoslavia. The more moderate countries within the non-allied movements to working group reports. But in fact, they have a problem of resources. So they rather turn to principles such as inalienable right or self-determination on whether they acquired sensitive nuclear technologies or not, or the assertions that any country have right to import any kind of nuclear technologies. So that the chairs of each working groups and TCCs struggle to include variety of opinions from technical assessment to political assertions from the South in final report. So that on section 4, the final plenary conference of IMSE is scheduled to be held on February 1980. So they are wrapping up the working group reports, but that is counted more than 20,000 pages in total of 8 working groups. So TCC, the Technical Coordination Committee, made a summary and overview of these working group reports, but that still had 85 pages. So they made a summary of the summary of working group reports. That is called elements of INSEC prepared by TCC. But TCC meeting held until the midnight of February 23rd, just a day before the plenary conference, final plenary conference. And still, as you can see on slide 3, this is an actual document from the UK archive. You can see the paper called Elements are still 26 pages, having 86 sections. So it's still long. But they have to write this length of documents because they have so diverged opinions within the participants of INSEE. And finally, there was a problem of chairmanship. of Final Plenary Conference. The US gathered support for Sir Herman Bondi from UK delegation for the chairman of Final Plenary Conference. And the United States and the United Kingdom got the support from almost all participants. But suddenly, on February 22nd, the G77 or non-aligned movement suddenly made objection to the chairman, Herman Bondi. That is because he came from nuclear weapons state. There are no clear indication in the documents available or documents I saw from US, UK, and Japanese archives. But I can make a guess from the situation at that time. The first, non-aligned movement demanded democratization of international disarmament institutions. So it says not about disarmament, but rather on the peaceful use of nuclear power. But I guess NAM or G77 might be concerned about this because on second, France became IAEA board chair for the first time as nuclear weapons state from 1979 to 1980. So anyway, the Bondi declined to be a chairman. So at the very last stage of before the final plenary conference, the Yatabe Atsuhiko of Japanese delegation became chairman because Japan was non-nuclear weapons state, but still had advanced nuclear industry. So that Mr. Yatabe also has the technical knowledge. And also Japan had good relations with United States, Western European countries, and also developing countries. So that no participating countries opposed to the Japanese chairmanship. So please proceed to the page 3. So that under chairmanship of Yatabe, final plenary conference was started and successfully adopted final reports and communique of INFSE. But North-South confrontation continued in the background of the final plenary. For instance, in making final communique at the draft committee, Philippines suddenly demanded to add urgent needs, not the special needs, for developing countries. So that is because Philippines wants to import nuclear technologies or materials from other countries under the assistance of IAEA. But the Philippines failed by oppositions of both developed and moderate developing countries, such as India. And also, but even countries, moderate countries such as India or Yugoslavia showed concerns at their speeches of conference for inadequate discussion of technical assistance for developing countries. And also, the elements prepared by TCC before the conference was not adopted at the conference because the countries which did not participate to TCC opposed to the procedure to make this report. The making element is not in terms of reference of TCC. So after INFSE, the discussion on the demand of the South was continued at IAEA for especially establishing so-called post-INFSE international regimes. That is such as international management of plutonium or spent fuel and assurance of supply of technologies or materials. So as a conclusion, I will finish in a minute. Even after INFSE, the fault line between North and South was stretched because as the North, the bilateral talks continued between US and European countries and Japan. So they agreed on a nuclear cooperation agreement and tighter control of export of nuclear technologies. And even Japan defined itself as very different from developing countries, having low nuclear non-proliferation credibility. But on the South, none of the proposed international regimes established because of the confrontation between North and South, and also South and South, between the NPT signatories or non-signatories, or countries like India and others. So INFCE was successfully ended by restoring cooperation within the North. But also it was successful because raised the concern of the South remained. And that concern of the South might be led to the, or at least be an undercurrent to the acrimonious NPT review conferences today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the presentations. I have now, again, the respectful expectation that the discussant, Pascal Lucas, as you well know, would please take the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the three wonderful presentations. And I want to keep my questions short so that we can have another 20-25 minutes to discuss. I have two questions, one for Zhan and one for Yoko. The issues that you talked about, I'm not entirely familiar with, but I was wondering that since China did not join the NUM movement, the non-aligned movement, but it is an observer state. I'm not entirely sure when it became an observer state, but did that participation with the NUM movement have any kind of impact on the three, within or on these three stages of development that you were discussing? That's the first one. And the second one, since I'm like concerned with this neutrality question, is, it's funny, but China, by the way that it conducted its alliance strategies, which it doesn't have, is kind of, even today, still, it does the same thing like neutral countries. It doesn't do alliances. Like military alliance, there's no Chinese NATO. China is going it alone when it comes to military power. Did that position of going it alone for military power have any impacts on its decisions in these three stages? And my second question to Yoko is, and I'm sorry I'm bringing this again to my neutrality topic, but yeah, that's what I'm here for. So the Japan, there was a discussion about neutralizing Japan right after the war, including MacArthur, who actually first was in favor of creating a neutral Japan, and there was a strong left-wing movement that was arguing for that in the immediate post-war period. In the end, it didn't happen. But was in that discussion any element of like nuclear thinking, or nothing to your knowledge? And to you, I will open the floor for questions because it's above my expertise to do. It was a very detailed presentation, which I very much appreciated. But we will open the floor for discussions of that in a moment. But maybe Zhan?
Yeah. Thank you. I read many papers about. You asked me about three stage. Yeah. I know. Some scholars divide China divide three states, and other scholars didn't agree with this state. But I know, I think invite three states depend on China participation in the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I think this one. So why China refused NPT in the second stage? I think maybe one is about history reason, and the United States and the Soviet Union threatened use nuclear weapons against China, and but China think especially talking economic reform, but China think the Soviet Union and the United States threaten China. The second, I think, in the 1980s, the arms race, Soviet Union and the United States arms race in test during the 1980s. And the second, I think maybe for leader Deng. I think Deng is, for economic, it is realism, and for NPT, I think it is idealism. So I think this is most of the paper, most scholar divided into three stages.
Did the fact that China was not trying to build an alliance have an impact on this? Was that important to strategic thinking about nuclear, about its opposition to the NPT, or not? No? Okay. If no, then no. Thank you. Yoko?
Thank you for the question, Pascal. Neutrality. I think the Japanese constitution is set at the very early stage of the Cold War, 46-47. So that kind of restricts the choices, but I think the so-called Yoshida school, this was the mainstream of the liberal Democrats, and they chose the American alliance and very light rearmament of Japan, and the combination. The left was unhappy about the one-sidedness of the peace treaty. They wanted also peace treaty with the Soviet Union, and those people would have wanted neutrality, unarmed neutrality, which was totally unrealistic. And I think there were isolated thinkers propagating armed neutrality like Switzerland, but that never really gained any popularity. On the right, there were small factions here and there in the Liberal Democrats and also in MOFA, who was unhappy about the kind of, they felt insulted that Japan was taken away the possibility of a goalless-like diplomacy, I think they were wishing for. So these small fraction people, they would not have called it neutrality. I think they would have called it independence. And these people would have probably wanted nuclear weapons like France. But that was also, I wrote this in my piece in the Routledge book, that was also a very small fraction of the MOFA. But it did have a big voice, and media likes to spotlight these people and say, look, Japan also wanted nuclear weapons. There were isolated ideas about that, but I don't think they used the word neutrality in that. If anybody in the floor knows more, please jump in.
Okay, and so that opens the floor for questions, please. Carlo, and then, yes, John?
Thank you very much. It was a great panel, illuminating on several aspects. I have a question for each of you. I wanted to know from seeing how China was committed after the agreement with the United States on 1984 not to cooperate with ambiguous countries, because I saw some documents that in the very same period of the negotiation with the United States, China was actually cooperating with an ambiguous country like Brazil. So I was thinking how China was committed to this agreement with the United States, and if this agreement actually was just a way to exceed the US nuclear technology. A question to Yoko. I would like to understand, since Japan was not a member of the ENDC, how Japan tried to influence the NPT negotiation using the non-aligned members of the NDC, because they saw a lot of communication between Brazil and Japan on the issue. And the last point to you is very great paper. There are very few studies on IMSA, and it would be great to see your paper published. And I have a comment on the south side of the north-south contrast. I saw that since the conference of Salzburg, Brazil actually decided not to play a central role in the IMSA because they thought that it was just a useless initiative by the Carter administration, and it was just the final scope of this conference was just to eliminate the plutonium economy that was important for both Brazil and Argentina and other developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and this was a wonderful panel. I think Carlo preempted my own question to Professor Zhan about China's interest in American nuclear technology. I know reading George Shultz's memoirs, for instance, he mentions meeting with American corporate salespeople in Beijing in 1983, I believe, from General Electric, GE, and Westinghouse. And he joked somewhat acidly in his memoirs that they sounded like the Chinese government, that US nuclear corporations were more interested in trading with China than they were in US non-proliferation policy. And he was quite upset about this. So I'm curious what the view from Beijing was. For Dr. Yoko, there's a somewhat unfair question I can pitch to you because your narrative really ends in 1970, and I'm curious what happens after that 6-year period from the Japanese signature to Japanese ratification. The literature and the primary sources I've seen seem to suggest that Nixon was at best ambivalent about the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there's also some signs, including from the White House tapes, that he and Kissinger thought that Japanese flirtation, what we scholars would call nuclear latency, could be very helpful to their own purposes in the region as a kind of stick to wield against the PRC. So, and against, sort of to help their efforts to triangulate between Beijing and Moscow. And I'm just curious what evidence you've seen from the Japanese side. Did they agree? Were they surprised? Was the message sort of received and understood?
One more question from Heinz, and then we'll go to the answers.
Thank you. I'm coming back to the current affairs as well. But in 1987, the treaty between Gorbachev and Reagan about the medium-range missiles have been adopted. And this is basically the only treaty which met 100% the requirements by the NPT Article 6, because it was an entirely category of weapons was abolished, not modernized. So ICBMs and Assault and START have been modernized at the same time. But at that time, in '87, nobody thought about China, so it was a bilateral treaty between Soviet Union and the US. Now, since the Trump administration withdrew from the treaty and Russia followed suit, The main reason for that was China, because they said China now has about 80% of the missiles, medium-range missiles. So what happened in China between 87 and now, that the treaty was basically abandoned because of China. And then I want to ask, and now, of course, Russia and the US want to deploy medium-range missiles in Asia. So Russia it's easy, but the US is looking for places where they can deploy them. Guam would be one possibility. It goes a little bit further than the range of the medium-range missiles. However, other places of deployment are, because they're territorial based, Japan and South Korea. So if the US would come with a request to Japan to deploy these medium-range missiles, would Japan accept this?
Very tacit questions. Then we start with Zhan, please.
Yeah. First question about nuclear cooperation with Brazil. Yeah, and I know in the 1980s, China cooperates with many countries for nuclear energy, including Brazil from 1980s to 1990s, and Brazil, France, British, and Japan, and the Soviet Union, I remember. But with the United States, it is very, very difficult with negotiations, very, very difficult. So the United States had talked about high price for China, including China master join into international nuclear proliferation, and so China government at the same time cooperates with many countries, including Brazil. I think it is a choice and in economic choice. So I know finally China cooperates with France, build a nuclear power station in Guangdong, and this is first China nuclear power station in 1980s. And the second question about yeah, I try to answer the question. I know with the improvement of China under the United States in the 1970s, and the United States, on one hand, the United States very about Chinese nuclear program. So the United States try to bring China into international nuclear proliferation regime. The second, the United States regard China as a partner against Soviet Union from 1970s. So I think the United States think very about Chinese nuclear program. So from Nixon administration, the United States try to bring China into the international nuclear program, Non-Proliferation. And many companies I know, like GE, like Westinghouse, into China and try to dynamic with China. I know. But I said the United States have high many maybe I think the United States have used many methods with China into the international nuclear program, proliferation. Yeah. This question I didn't understand.
Basically, the question was, China was developing its missile program since '87 to now that both superpowers, nuclear powers, are got nervous about China. They want to include China into the negotiations. So all the missiles that basically should be included in multilateral negotiations that what Trump asked for. Would China basically accept this multilateral negotiations to include its missile programs in the negotiations between US, Russia, India, Pakistan, China? So that was Trump who was suggesting. So that's basically what China accept this.
That would be your first for multilateral.
Officially, China accept.
Okay, in that case, Yoko, please.
Yes. I looked at both Japan and West Germany, and their strategy are basically the same. And this happens in the several months from the beginning to the summer of 1968, that they try to get as much as they can. I'm not sure if they have this consciousness of non-aligned movement countries, but on behalf of the non-nuclear states, non-nuclear weapon states, they want to get as much as they can in terms of review conferences, in terms of obligations of nuclear weapon powers to for disarmament, and then for the guarantee of peaceful use of nuclear technology. So they're pushing very hard to propagate themselves as the leader of non-nuclear weapon states, and also to gain access to the 18 Nations Committee. Now, West Germany is not a member of the UN at this moment, and they did not apply to become the member of the Geneva Committee. I haven't really seen the correspondence between Japan and Brazil. Japan was closely corresponding with the potential sort of threshold countries like Australia, like Italy, and of course West Germany. So there's a huge correspondence between Japan and Australia. I haven't seen many of them, but this happens really in the first months of '68, and then once it's open for signature, you can't really change the text anymore. So it becomes, what we want to get into, be able to influence the review conferences and so on. But if anybody else has any addition, please jump in. After the signature, Nixon administration, Gorok-san is the specialist on Nixon administration, so I'll ask him to jump in, but I'll just say that in Japan, first it was the Okinawa reversion that was the most important, and the non-nuclear status of Okinawa, that it comes back without nuclear weapons. So this was the top priority. And then after that, Nixon, Kissinger, did they offer to Chinese, we can keep Japan non-nuclear and push them to join NPT if you would do this and this and that for us. We have been always suspicious. I don't think we have found any evidence on this, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. And Wilson, do you want to jump in?
What you say is that Nixon told the Japanese side in 1972, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, actually Japan joined but Japan signed the NPT in 1970. So as a Nixon administration as a whole, the administration's policy is, of course, let Japan become NPT countries. But they are sure that Japan has already been signing NPT in 1970. That's why Nixon and Kissinger want to use the very ambiguous status, not the ratifying, but already becoming, already the signing the NPT toward triangle diplomacy, especially vis-a-vis China. So, well, I know there is academic debate on how the Nixon and the Kissinger are serious about NPT, but as far as I understand, especially vis-a-vis Japan and vis-a-vis Western Germany, I think Nixon and Kissinger are very worried about their nuclearized status. That's why they are not pushing, they are not pressure on both countries to become NPT country. And instead of that, they, by not pressing to both countries, they try to secure their joining the NPT, and they finally succeeded in 1969 and 1917. Western Germany joined in 1969, and Japan signed in 1970. All what you said, Nixon told the Japanese side, how about keeping the status non-ratifying country is all about after the 1970s, so maybe 72 and 74. So I think Mr. Ota also knows this very much about that.
Yeah. Master would like to say more.
Just one question to Iwama Sensei. I was directly involved with the ratification of Japanese, and I was in charge of it. In 1975, we started discussing the ratification in Japanese parliament, and that was the time when the first review conference was held. And NPT's target was, as you mentioned, West Germany and Japan to join it. And we had indirect pressure from the United States of America to ratify it. So we had a lot of say to the first review conference in 1975. And we put forward a lot of ideas to be incorporated in the NPT. And one of the points Japan raised was the duration of the NPT. And finally, our wish was incorporated 25 years ago. 25-year duration of the treaty, or indefinite without any time limit. So all the necessary, all the points we raised to be incorporated in NPT was accepted because simply international community wanted Japan to become a member. So that's what I wrote in my
Thank you for jumping in.
I'm sorry for that.
We conducted an oral history about the ratification process, and it's published, in Japanese. I just wanted to add that this process from 69 to 76, or 70 to 76, it's partly about verification treaty, and we're waiting until the Europeans settle with IAEA, and it's partly about domestic politics, both in West Germany and in Japan. There's a fraction in the conservative ground that are quite unhappy about giving up nuclear weapons, and we're sort of waiting until the conditions are right, and all these negotiations with the ENDC. This is partly to show the domestic audience that we've gained all what we can gain, so let's sign it and ratify it now.
Just quick.
Takeda, please. Thank you for the comment regarding Brazil's participation to INFSE. What is interesting regarding Brazil is when first United States asked Brazil to what do you think about INFSE in May, just before the Salzburg conference. The Brazil showed very negative response to Takada's idea. But after that, Takada was forced to have a meeting with other G7 members, including Japan and Western European countries. And they held the meetings of specialists of G7. And that meeting of specialists agreed on the conclusions that INFSE will be a non-binding technical conference in August. So in August, US asked again to Brazil and other developing countries to whether they will participate. And all of them responded very positively to the INFSE. So yes, from the beginning, the Carter's non-proliferation policy doesn't running very well. So thank you for your comment.
If there are any other questions, then I would take the liberty of thanking our host, our audience, our colleagues, and also those who have helped with the administration of these last 2 days. Again, thank you, and look forward to the next event. Thank you very much for the presentation.